When you think of the term high culture, what does that bring to mind? I think that that idea has a lot of connotations for a lot of different people that maybe are not necessarily positive. We have a distinction between high culture and low culture. Oftentimes, high culture is seen as simply the culture of the wealthy people, and low culture is the culture of everybody else. So sometimes when you look at discourse surrounding high culture, it's viewed as a kind of classism to identify high culture as something that is better than low culture, or high culture that is better than other aspects of our culture. And we're speaking specifically here of Western culture. We could talk about other things otherwise. But so for example, a lot of leftist thinkers, especially some sociologists, have made the arguments that what differs in taste is really class. And that the taste that differs depending upon class is not that there's something necessarily greater about, say, the upper classes and their taste than the lower classes. It simply just is kind of the sociological reality that they develop distinct tastes to keep their own class distinct. In other words, to keep themselves in power. And this is clearly a kind of neo-Marxist reading of the way that classes work that necessarily says that that which is privileged to be the best in a given society tends to be that which helps to maintain cultural hegemony so that those that are in the upper classes, the upper echelons, continue to retain their power. So they're going to, for example, privilege works that have ideals that they have. They're going to privilege works that support things like obedience to the class system, and they are part of the class system. So therefore, those works help to kind of maintain their own power. And that's, of course, a very cynical view of the reality of culture and the inheritance of culture, to say that it's simply the result of negative power dynamics of one oppressor group forcing their ideals on another. And oftentimes this approach to, say, great literature would say that the choices of what works of literature, say, are best in culture, what works of literature we read in schools, are merely the product of these basic power dynamics. And so it may be argued, for example, that there is nothing necessarily better about Shakespeare than some other poet. It just happens to be that Shakespeare was kind of arbitrarily chosen as this touch point for a Western European society for one reason or another. And usually the reason for that has something to do with maintaining class interests. Now, I would push against that entire narrative, and I think that high culture is something that is good and should be retained and recaptured, and that we are in a negative place culturally, in my view, for having jettisoned the central aspects of high culture and replacing it largely with not just mass culture, but pop culture. So in order to start this, I want to define three aspects of culture. And maybe I should start even more in a more basic way than that and say, what is culture in general? When we're talking about culture, there are a number of different definitions of culture. I could have a separate video on proposals for that. But generally, we're talking about media, art, literature, religion, social custom, the values and morality of a society. These are all, there are many things that make up culture. It's kind of an all-encompassing term for a society and what they value and the things that they make. And by things that they make, I don't just mean, material goods. By things they make, I mean the, music and art that is made from a particular society with a number of shared values and rituals. So all of that makes up culture. So when we're talking about culture in our current context, oftentimes that can be divided up into three different kinds of cultures. So we have high culture, and high culture tends to be that which is of the upper classes. However, that does not simply mean that these are the things that are only to be valued by the upper classes, nor does it mean that these are things that only should be or are accessible to the upper classes. Nor does it mean that everything that the upper classes like is necessarily better than the things that the lower classes like. But generally, high culture are those things that emphasize, that come from an extensive amount of learning. So think about the culture of the ancient Greeks. So something like high culture would be looking at the era of the Renaissance, that those who were learned at that particular time started to rediscover the classical works of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans and use that to create the kind of paintings that they created and the buildings that they created. And you can look at this throughout history. Generally, high culture is considered those things that have their roots largely in that Greco-Roman kind of ideal. So if you look at the operas that are usually considered the most kind of upper class operas in certain time periods in history, it tends to be those more dramatic operas that tend to be retellings of narratives of the ancient Greek myths, for example. So, you have La Orfeo or something like that. And that's generally true of literature or poetry as well. There often are roots in that kind of ancient Greek part of culture that it does take some amount of education in order to understand the references that are being made in a work like that. Now, it certainly doesn't mean that you need to understand every reference in order to appreciate a work. I actually reject the idea that the best works are those that are just dependent upon the reader knowing all of the references and making a work completely inaccessible to someone who doesn't have all of the references or nuance or ability academically to understand where all of the terms come from. So if you look at something like James Joyce's Ulysses, that's a work that basically is entirely dependent upon knowledge of lots of aspects of culture, specifically high culture, so that it's a completely inaccessible book apart from that. I think a work of art that is something that is valuable generally, this is not always the case, but generally is something that is accessible to some extent, and those who do not have the education necessary can appreciate the art or see some kind of beauty or goodness in it or enjoyment in it. But those who have that background of what maybe is being referenced have then another level of appreciation because of their learning. So I think the best aspects of culture, cultural production, really are things that can be understood more broadly. So we've got high culture, which tends to be that which is rooted, as I said, in the ancient Greeks and in the Renaissance. You could think of things like opera tends to be considered high culture, or other things as well. And some of it is financially prohibitive, but financial prohibition does not make it high culture. We can think of plenty of things that you have to be wealthy to have, but they aren't seen as high culture. For example, look at Bugattis or something, right? They're cars that you can only buy if you have an insane amount of money. But they're sports cars and they're cool or whatever. But there's clearly a difference between something that is just expensive and something that is considered to have class, which is really more what we're talking about with high culture. So it's not just the matter of money by any means. So there's high culture on the one hand, and then there is folk culture. Now, folk culture is that which is deeply rooted in a particular people group in a particular location, and oftentimes that culture, it's a series of song rituals that arise kind of from the ground up, and so it's not something that is at its roots simply the academics or intellectuals of society or those in the upper classes that are producing this kind of material. It's something that just kind of flows from ordinary folk culture, right? So ordinary folk creating their own music and ritual or dance or performances or art. And these things tend to be quite lasting, just as high culture is. Folk rituals are things that when you have a community where people are living in that area for a long time, they're things that people memorize or learn as kids, and things that the community does together. So there's a lot of beauty in folk culture, just as there is in high culture. So as I'm speaking about a defense of high culture, I'm not pitting high culture against folk culture. I'm saying these are both wonderful products of human civilization and society as it has been passed down and as we have inherited it. But then we have this third aspect of culture that really has come to dominate almost all cultural discourse today, that I contend does not have the same kind of value as these other two forms of culture, and that is pop culture. So when we're talking about pop culture now, we're speaking about something very different from both high culture, which is largely passed down, through the academy or the upper classes, and then folk culture, which is passed down generationally within a particular place among a particular people that have shared ideas and values. Pop culture is a series of works of production that's really only possible in an industrialized society. A series of works of production that are produced for the masses for the sole purpose of entertainment. And their pop culture is made to entertain. Pop culture is not made to necessarily be lasting. So folk culture, you have some of the same rituals and art forms that last for generations and generations and generations and generations. And high culture, by nature, is those particular works of art that have been seen to be valuable enough that they have become what's part of the canon. And we can speak of a canon in terms of a literary canon, or what's called the Western canon of literature, but we can also speak about even a theological canon of the texts and works that have survived and been influential throughout history. We can speak of musical canons, whether we're talking about classical music or hymnody. There are plenty of things that last, and only the best lasts. There's a general reason why some pieces of classical music that were written 400 years ago, and there are other pieces that you've never heard. And it doesn't mean that none of the pieces you've never heard are good, but largely we tend to pass on the things that are worth passing on, the things that tend to be more valuable. There's some kind of connecting point in that extends beyond generations, so that I can connect with the music of Bach just as much as someone who's living in Bach's own time was able to do. There's something that transcends beyond particular cultures and times about that piece of music that does that. And the same is true of literature and other aspects of high culture as well. But pop culture, the products of pop culture are not designed to be lasting. The products of pop culture are designed to entertain for a time, and then we move on to something else. And then we move on to something else. And then we move on to something else. So if you think about, the kinds of TV shows people watched in the 1990s versus the 1980s versus the 1970s, they change constantly. And it's not like people are just constantly going back and rewatching the Dick Van Dyke Show. Now, just like any other cultural enterprise, there are going to be those products that do arise out of pop culture that are going to have a little bit more of a lasting influence. There are going to be those products, hopefully, that are somewhat valuable, that are going to be watched for multiple generations. But pop culture, by its very nature, does not seek for that. It does not search for that. It does not try to do that. It is something that is produced kind of top down. It's produced for the masses, but not coming up by the masses themselves, or in the way that folk culture does. But it's kind of created in a top down way that people control the media. They send their products of production to entertain the masses, so that the masses will pay money to those who are in charge, so that they then get more money and can produce more things. And it then becomes a very powerful tool. It becomes a very powerful tool of a political influence, so that those who are in control of pop culture or mass media can decide what values they want the populace to hold to, and they can kind of change it on a whim. And because there is nothing kind of lasting about this material in the way that there is about folk culture and high culture, it's very easy to change the political ideas or morality or values within this particular part of culture, because it's just changing all the time. That's just the nature of what it is. So because of that, it doesn't have the kind of power to push back against ideas or bad ideas, novel ideas that may not be good, that high culture or folk culture do, because by nature it just passes away and you just move on to the next thing. So this is just all to say that there is value in high culture. There is significant value beyond just this being, one oppressive class trying to force its ideas or hegemony on others. In fact, I think where you really do see that, and that's generally a Marxist critique, where you do see that is actually in pop culture. Because pop culture is the culture that is controlled by this particular group of people that has control of things. They use it to control the masses, and they stick whatever values they want and want to force on you because they know that you're just a consumer and you're just going to consume it. So recapturing the high culture and the high art of our Western civilization is an essential pushback against that. And this means as people, we need to be ourselves learning from that culture. The great thing about high culture today is that these are no longer inaccessible. These aren't things that are only for a certain class that has a certain amount of money. Now, this is the great thing about our society today, is that these cultural products are opened up. You can, I've got my Barnes & Noble Nook e-reader here. I can, get the entire works of Jane Austen for 99 cents on here if I want and read them. I can go on YouTube and find performances of Mozart's operas for free. Never before has society been able to have access to the beauties of our culture. And the sad thing is, as soon as we get access, instead of delighting in the best that our culture has created, we tend to then just watch whatever happens to entertain us and give us some kind of brief moments of laughter or whatever for a few minutes. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that all of that is bad and we can never watch movies or anything like that. But we need to be rooted far beyond what is in pop culture. We need to have our roots and understanding of our culture through those products that have lasted throughout many generations. So I have a lot that I would love to say on this. So let me know if you want me to do more videos on the topic of culture. I just finished reading a really good work. Didn't agree with everything in it, but it's a 19th century book called Culture and Anarchy by Matthew Arnold, which lays out some of these defenses of high culture within an era of industrialization, which is kind of a counter to the Marxist narrative, because the Marxists are criticizing industrialization as well, but their solution is tear it all down. And the solution of Arnold is instead, let's recapture our culture. Let's recapture the beauty of culture and not focus on production and mechanical production of things and the money that can bring. I'd love to actually do a talk on him if you guys have interest, so let me know. Make sure you subscribe here on YouTube, and you can subscribe to our podcast, the Justin Center Podcast, on any podcast app that you have. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.